Hello and welcome to our video on JavaScript. I'm Andrew.
And I'm Jordan.
Let's start with the history of JavaScript. In 1994, the company Netscape created a web browser called Navigator. Originally, they wanted to include Java in their browser, but they soon realized Java was too static for their needs, and a more dynamic scripting language was needed. So they decided to build a language with the style and syntax of Sun Microsystems Java in mind. Brennan Eich was hired by the company, and he created JavaScript. Here are the main features. JavaScript is a powerful language which facilitates efficient website design with the use of such constructs as functions and loops. It also allows for dynamic functionality and client browser detection for platform-independent code. Here are the language constructs. There is dynamic variable declaration and assignment. As you can see, the variable num is assigned to a number value of 2, and later it rebound to a string type. There's support for arithmetic, logical, and conditional operations. And there's also support for function specification and invocation, including parameters and return statements. JavaScript also has support for basic for and while loops, and for type conversion. And HTML events can prompt JavaScript code execution. HTML elements can also be referenced by a unique ID or by a name or a class, which can refer to multiple elements.
jQuery is a JavaScript library that you can import into your project. All jQuery commands and functions start with a $sign. One of the main features of jQuery is how it handles events. jQuery allows for writing a single piece of code that can be executed whenever an element of a particular ID, name, or class is clicked upon. Note the function part. This is actually a standard JavaScript function that the jQuery function takes as an argument. This function gets executed whenever the HTML element search button gets clicked. Our program is called Environmental News. It's a website that allows users to search through environmentally themed articles based on keywords. Please note that these articles originate from other sites and are used to demonstrate our site's functionality. We did not write these articles. Welcome to our site, Enviro News, your #1 source for the news you care about. Let's look at the menu bar. If you click the Home button, the entire web page is reloaded. If you click Global Warming, the keywords global warming are entered into the search bar. Let's search for an article with keywords global warming. Let's look at an article about drought in the Mediterranean. Note that when you load an article or search for an article, only the content pane gets reloaded. The rest of the page remains static. Also see how the content pane expands as needed. The content pane is followed by the footer, which contains our names.
Let's go ahead and search for a different keyword. This time, I'll choose habitat. Let's pick global warming and waterfowl. As you can see, again, only the content pane changes to include the article.
Now let's take a look at the code. The articles database is stored in a JSON file format. This stands for JavaScript Object Notation. It could be stored in a separate file when imported, but for this demonstration it's hard-coded. Think of this as just a list of objects, where each object has a title, a string of keywords separated by commas, and a link that links to the HTML file on the web page that includes the article HTML to be loaded when the article is clicked. Now let's take a look at the search function. First, we're going to set the content pane to just display a default message. Then for every keyword entered into the search bar, we're going to search through every keyword in the database. If the keyword matches a keyword in the database, and the title of that article hasn't yet been printed to the page, then the title of that article will be printed to the page. There's a few important things to note. Notice that when we print the article to the page, we set the ID of that HTML element to be the index, which we'll use later, the index of the article in the database. And we also set the class to be search titles. Now let's take a look at the function for when a search title is clicked. Remember that we stored the ID as the index of the article in the database earlier? The class for each article title that we printed is also called search titles. This is important for when the search title is clicked. So we get the ID of whatever element is clicked because this function is called whenever a function of the class search titles is clicked. It doesn't rely on the ID. So we get the ID of whatever element is clicked, but that also happens to be the index. Next, we're going to use an API called Ajax. This API is in JavaScript and jQuery. We're going to use the jQuery version of the API. This API allows for the getting and pushing of HTML files and other file formats such as JSON within JavaScript. Finally, if the API call returns successfully, we're going to call a function. We're going to pass in the result of the API call to that function. Inside that function, we're going to set the HTML of the content pane to be equal to the HTML in the file, thus loading the article to the web page.
In designing our program, we wanted a search capability that allows the user to search for keywords they want regarding environmental issues. This prevents the need to sift through unrelated content and provides a streamlined interface for the user. With more articles and a wider variety of information, this design becomes more powerful. Now we'll discuss our impressions with the language. JavaScript essentially modifies HTML elements on the fly, so to use JavaScript effectively requires a solid understanding of HTML and CSS. Originally, we thought we'd pick up HTML as needed while learning JavaScript, but we soon realized we need to go through a tutorial. As a result, there was a lot of trial and error in this process of learning HTML to make the website look and feel as we wanted it to. Compared to other modern web development languages such as PHP and Ruby, JavaScript is unique in that it is executed client-side by the web browser instead of by the web server. This makes JavaScript great for simple tasks and non-sensitive data, as the workload is handled by the computer connecting to the site. However, JavaScript isn't designed to handle data such as passwords. There's no ideal way to securely store the data, and you can't query a MySQL database with JavaScript, because if that were possible, anyone could run queries on your database.
HTML does not work the same in all web browsers. Every web browser has a different set of commands for more complex things. The solution to this is to include a default simple line of code for web browsers you don't support and a more complex line of code for each web browser that you do want to support. An example of this is our menu bar. We wanted a gradient background. All these lines of code are back-to-back in the CSS file. Notice that for each web browser we wanted to support, Firefox, Google Chrome, and Internet Explorer, we needed a different line of code to produce a gradient background. If the web browser runs into a line of code it doesn't recognize, it simply skips it. Another thing is JavaScript events might not work how you expect them to. For example, the standard .click function is bound at page load, so it won't work on dynamically created elements. I couldn't figure out why my search titles weren't working when I clicked on them. It turns out I needed to use a different function that wasn't bound on page load in order to click on dynamically created elements. We would also like to thank our sources. We got our articles from NASA and the National Wildlife Foundation. Our tutorials were from W3 Schools. We looked up history about JavaScript from our other two sources. Thank you for watching our video on JavaScript.
And remember to care about the Earth and its many forms of life.